we live in a really pessimistic, negative world. That's what empowers our news cycle, what empowers everything we hear. What's the value of the mom? What's the value of a human? What role do we play in this world that really is going to be so unknown a generation, 2 generations from now? And my own work is focused on the future. We hear pitches every day that are focused on really, I'm blown away. It's medical technology, it's artificial intelligence, it's robotics. It's things that you can't imagine are here already. But what's interesting about that is I thought of that in the context of my son, this little person. I kept looking back instead of looking ahead. And it was interesting because I spoke to him a few minutes before I came on stage, if you saw me outside, and he said, "Mommy, what are you talking about today?" I said, "Leo, I'm talking about you." And he goes, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I'm going to be talking about you. I'm going to be talking about the Nellies, the Coltons, the Teenies." They have strange names nowadays, but all these little people that are in our lives, and how do you prepare them for what's to come? All of our stories, for those of us that are parents, one-day parents, or surrounded by our own parents, it's this idea of the moment you find out you're expecting a baby. So mine began really rather funnily when I was told I was a geriatric mom. So, so immediately you're in a state of panic. So I did everything in those preparation months really to figure out what to do as an old mom. And so did everything, I think, by the book, did everything very, perfect as they told me, and then you transition to having this little bean in your hands, which was, of course, wonderful. And again, no screens, the right touch time, the right, nourished for the right amount of months, all of this. But the reality of parenthood, which we all know, is really the reality of the unknown. And our unknown began somewhat unexpectedly on June 13th, 2018. My son was about 1.5 years old. We had just been on a weekend vacation to Kennebunk Park. So the American dream vacation, we'll call it, on the beach, on the boat, enjoying life. We came home that Monday morning to a house with the lights on. So all the moms in the room can relate to the lights being left on. So I immediately write my husband, I won't spill the story and call him my then husband, but my husband, and I say, you left the lights on again. Please turn the lights off next time. He says, "I don't live there anymore." And I pause. I have like a baby, literally, would come up, a walk up in Beacon Hill and, put the baby down and do a walk around the house, opening closets, and sure enough, all his stuff was gone. What was interesting about that reality and about that timing was I was 12 days away from starting graduate school at Harvard. And so suddenly, we entered this new chapter of the unknown. I will say that was one of the happiest years of my life. But truly, because of what I'll talk to you a little bit about today, it really was about people. I didn't know how to really maneuver single parenthood. My parents have now been married for 50 years, strong values in terms of marriage. I didn't want my son to be a part of the stat, which the stat was, I've just learned, it's 23%, I think, of American children are raised by a single parent. If you're a Black boy or Black child, that stat is over 51%. So certainly I was cognizant of this challenge that I was now facing. I'll hear even to today is parents saying the iPad is my babysitter. And again, I was someone that with my son, he was still not watching screens. I didn't want that to be our case. And so immediately, I knew I didn't want to be reliant on technology, but I wanted to be able to lean into technology. And so what was interesting about being a single parent, and that still remains the case 6 years later, is I think this closeness that we have, my son and I were together all the time, is really a deeper insight into the critical skills and tools needed to raise a child to be ready for tomorrow. And I don't think these values are so different from yesterday. So I'm going to take you back a little bit, just very briefly, into the Industrial Revolutions. I didn't know we were living in an industrial revolution, which is sad. Don't tell my colleagues. But so the first industrial revolution, we'll say, was the late 18th, early 19th century. And this was really a transition from, I think they call the agrarian culture, agrarian society, agriculture, to industrialization. Really cool if you think about it. So steam engines, iron, coal industries, manufacturing, innovation really became the way of the world. What's also interesting, if you imagine living on a farm, is there wasn't a lot of access to education. So we're really at the beginning of where large scale, I would say, access to public education, education as a whole, became a normality for society, which is awesome. So then you speed ahead about 100 years later, we continue to evolve. Pace like this is the second industrial revolution. And the second industrial revolution is the telephone, the light bulb, railways. Access to education continued to increase. Literacy also greatly increased. You get into key skills. I think you get into the first iteration of knowledge workers. Adaptability, curiosity, creativity. You start to see those concepts really introduced into society, where before it was really survival and, doing what you needed to do to make things work day to day. And then you get into where most of us have grown up in. I would say all of us, unless we have an 100-year-old in the audience, is the third industrial revolution, which is the late 20th to the early 21st century. And this is where we grew up with the introduction of the computer, of the cell phone, of tools that really changed the way we work, but really individualized as well the way we worked. Digital communication became an alternative to in-person communication. And we saw that in COVID. It was very interesting, of course. We learned how to work by ourselves independently, efficiently. But that, of course, has led all that time, I would say, working with these new technical tools to where we are today. And that is the fourth industrial revolution. I would say the lines begin to get blurred a little bit between disciplines at this point. And you see it in some of the educations of our children, and how they're taught is the integration of the different, of science with technology, with math, and with phonics. But what you start to see, and again, where I looked back, was speed is key. It's really interesting for a child. I'm not teaching my son to compete against a ChatGPT. Instead, in contrast, I'm teaching him to guide a ChatGPT, which is why values become so important. But it's impossible to create or to raise a child with a very educated person, let's say, would have a range maybe of about 40,000 words, when ChatGPT has 10 million words it's pulling from in the matter of seconds. So again, we get into values. And this is where I introduce you a little bit into the 4 C's. And I use a little bit, I want to stop and pause at this drawing. You will see very creatively written is the future. And so this is the future. I do feel like this drawing could have been made in the first industrial revolution. But with them, you see a space creature, a sea creature, some animals, a building, some underground animals. You see everything. And that's what they see when they think of the future. They see everything absolutely as possible. And so this was a drawing actually from my son's table, and this is what they decided to name themselves this spring. And so I share this with you because I also want to do very quick context setting. What I'm describing today with what I'll call the 4 C's originally was really related to technology, good use of technology, and raising children today. But it does also relate to all the other issues that they're facing, whether it's diversity and self-identification, to a climate that's, quickly deteriorating. We see these summers, and I think that all of this allows them to be really great citizens of the future. These 4 terms, 4 values, 4 words, really are what, for me, parenting has come down to. Curiosity, critical thinking, compassion, collaboration. You can't have one without the other. And so I start with curiosity. Again, I go back to the title of Why Ask Mommy if you can ask Google. In our house, it might be Alexa. And so my son, he's funny, but he challenges Alexa, and I'll get into that briefly. But it's interesting because you think of, what is he asking this machine? And I'm pretty cautious with technology without realizing it's in my house. And so it's funny with Leo, immediately, I would say in January, and we were just newly back in New England, and we got the spreadsheet from one of the moms in our mom group. And it was a spreadsheet week by week, every camp her child was going to for the summer. Robotics camp, farm camp, swim camp, soccer camp, everything. And I'm like, wow, is this what people do here? And it was overwhelming. I talked to my son about the camps. We looked at, again, what do we want to be teaching this little boy? He's only in one camp this summer. 1 week was theater camp. And we pulled him out of other camps, really thinking the time that we wanted to invest with him when he's not in a 8 to 3 school day was in person. It's interesting because I did look a little bit more into research, we all know it, where they recommend screen time really up until 5 or 6, only an hour a day. Physical time should be 3 hours a day. That seems tremendous, especially if you're at home with your kid. And so that has really become a priority for us, is teaching through experiential learning, is how to think, what to do, but in real life, not in an orchestrated way, not in a video, not on a YouTube advertisement. And this, I think, has really been tremendous. But where curiosity leads then becomes critical thinking. Critical thinking has become the open-ended question. Again, the why. So my son has tested, Alexa, why do people lie? Alexa does not have a good answer. So this is where mommy comes in. And it's interesting because, again, I don't think we're tested in that way and don't think about it necessarily on a day-to-day basis of how we're needed and what we're needed to do. But when you have this little person testing you with why questions all the time, it becomes very apparent. And it's really quite beautiful. And our advice to him really becomes, trust your heart. Think, what information do you have to make that decision? And those are the things a machine cannot teach you. And so once you get from critical thinking, you don't want just to be a robotic critical thinker. You have to have compassion. And so compassion, we live in a world of privilege. And we know it. We forget it all the time. A very quick, probably last story is my son in our school. He attends a private school, and most people are living in these beautiful homes in the area that we are. And one of the kids lives in an apartment. So my 5-year-old son goes over to their house for a play date. And he says, "Where's the rest of your house?" And of course, if we lived in New York, an apartment wouldn't be such an unusual thing. But it broke my heart. But that's what we have shown him. And so in compassion, obviously we teach it every day. But for us, that is meant when we're making travel decisions. We go to countries, we go to third world countries where houses look different, where things are dilapidated, and where he is able to see that everything isn't a beautiful colonial in New England. And that has been really, I think, one of the great tools that he's learning in terms of how to evaluate the world and not take for granted that everything is what you see. And then finally, you can't get to collaboration, I think, without compassion. And it's the ability to work together and really a need for one another. And that's what we need to teach. I'm an only child, raising an only child. I've been told, even in the preparation for today, I'm not the best collaborator. So this is a lesson, and I find, and you will find, I think back to an old poster of everything you needed to learn, you learned in kindergarten, and so this is one of those lessons. I truly believe, and it's the ability to collaborate and work together. And what our kids will need is the ability with this technology is to be able to work with teams. Someone told me it's not going to be so important to learn languages. It's going to be important to learn language models, because you're going to be working with kids and with young people from around the world who all may speak that same language model. And that's, I think, this ability to look at different perspectives, look at people from around the world, people from different backgrounds, is what we need to consciously be aware of and expose our children to as much as we can. There's no perfect model. There's not one book in the How to Parent Your Kid section of a bookstore. So what I leave you with, and And this is what it's about. That's Leo. And that light in his eyes, that curiosity, that's what it's about. 200 years ago, in the first industrial revolution, that might have been from basic access to learning. Imagine that first book you opened. 100 years later, that light might have been from literally a light bulb. And so I can't imagine that. And then we move forward to that light maybe turning on a computer for a first time, recognizing the ability to type, to speed. And so now when we apply those, so interesting, it's not just 21st century, it's 22nd century. We're preparing them to be parents. We're preparing them for their own grandchildren. It's to be a citizen of the world. And I go back to really the law of unexpected consequences. And so I take you back as a parting thought to the second industrial revolution again, the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb. And so as much as we grapple with, you see it a lot in the news right now, how to use technology, how do we manage ethics, how do we do these things? We've learned already that needs to be managed and thought of. History does indeed repeat itself. There's nothing new or innovative in what I've described today. It's really back to basics. And so if I leave you with one thing or one takeaway, it's power and responsibility in science, ethical considerations of technical advancements, and the realization that things like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, surveillance, they are the atomic bombs of the future. And that's what we need to be preparing our children for. So I hope you remember that when you hug your children tonight and make decisions about the technology and innovation we bring into their lives. Thank you so much. Thank you.